There is such a thing as integrity. Some people are noble. There is such a thing as courage. The terrible thing is that the reality behind these words depends ultimately on what the human being, meaning every single one of us, believes to be real. The terrible thing is that the reality behind all of these words depends on choices one has got to make forever and ever and ever, every day. This is James Baldwin from a speech he gave in 1962 at the Community Church in New York City entitled The Artist's Struggle for Integrity.
One would think that after 10 years of being vocal about the dangers of Donald Trump, there would be a sense of, "I told you so," inside me. The outrage that comes with appealing to the wait and see, give the man a chance, folks, that since 2015 only now seem, in ridiculously small numbers, to be concerned because it's starting to directly affect them. Instead, in this moment, I only feel an incredible sense of loss, a tragic acknowledgement that at least 70-something million Americans have voted for this rampant disregard of our humanity 3 times. You may ask, why this response now, as each pebble continues to form into a perpetual landslide? Each day another step further into authoritarianism, each pebble representing yet another monumental loss of civility and right action. Yes, the neoliberal establishment, as in the Democratic Party's power structure, couldn't have set the stage more perfectly for this fall into oligarchy. But this de-evolution into stupid for the sake of greed, in the face of existential threats to the planet, can offer no excuse other than gross irresponsibility. We Americans have failed ourselves. For those who can hear me, grieve this moment. It will be our willingness to grieve that will give rise to new possibilities. With today's global civilization being deeply interconnected and unequal, we could see the worst societal collapse yet, says Luke Kemp, author of Goliath's Curse, a book which comes out next month in September of 2025. The threat from leaders who are walking versions of the dark triad, or so it's called. Narcissism, psychopathy, which is a personality construct characterized by impaired empathy and remorse, persistent antisocial behavior, along with bold, disinhibited, and egocentric traits. And the third of the triad, Machiavellianism, as in people who use cunning, duplicity, and bad faith to achieve their goals. All of this occurring in a world menaced by climate change, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, and killer robots. There's a concept expressed by Dr. Luke Kemp, phrased as self-termination. Self-termination is in essence a society's response to long-term inequity. But what happens when the society is global? Well, Kemp says collapses in the past were at a regional level and often beneficial for most people. But collapse today would be global and disastrous for all. Today, we don't have regional empires so much as we have one single interconnected global Goliath. All of our societies act within one single global economic system, which is still being called capitalism. We could call it end-stage capitalism. We could call it techno-feudalism, which we'll get to in a little while. But if we take Kemp's thesis, it's easy to posit that capitalism is reliant upon a growing number of humans. If we're not always expanding our population, capitalism inherently over time will collapse or radically alter itself. One might ask, will we live in a Star Trek-like future in a society beyond money? Is that the evolution, or a social democracy or an economic democracy where voters directly determine economic policy? Or will we live in a dystopian future where really every dystopian movie from the last 50 years is on the table? Will national borders always create economic instability? Trump's immigration policy and tariffs are creating an artificial contraction of the economy. What happens when the population minus immigrants continues to contract to the point where the economy is unable to expand? Oligarchs will tell you that's where techno-feudalism comes in, where AI comes in, where robotics comes in.
So, techno-feudalism. This is a concept that comes from Yanis Varoufakis, an economist, author, and he was also Greece's former Minister of Finance. He has a wonderfully insightful book on this called Techno-Feudalism, What Killed Capitalism. But in a nutshell, what Varoufakis breaks down as techno-feudalism is, and I quote, a socioeconomic system where power and control are concentrated in a few large technology companies, resembling the feudal structures of the past. In this system, these tech giants act like modern lords, exerting influence over data and digital spaces, while everyday users become dependent on their services.
We're not talking about a future world. We're talking about right now. Right? This isn't some fear of what might happen. It's where we are right now, and in many ways, why we talk about it with such fervor is because it is right now. And the problem with techno-feudalism is it places human beings and our needs last in line for resources, whether it be electricity or water or governmental services, oversight, everything. In many ways, our role as citizens is being radically changed. We are no longer citizens in the world. We are tragically human beings living out a long emergency.
We pause now in the conversation for a special message from Martin.
I've spent the better part of the last 30 years of my life practicing acupuncture and herbs, teaching meditation, teaching consciousness courses, and all of that will continue. But also over the last 20 years, I began an odyssey of, in essence, learning about my own creative life force. I began to learn something about myself, or let go of a story about myself centered around a negation of self. The story was, I'm not creative. And I began to build things, to make things, to create things in ways that allowed me to free myself from that story that I either make it perfectly or I don't make it at all. And so I began a journey where play and joy were the centerpieces of my creative process. I built my creative healing center. I built a treehouse. I rebuilt a barn I had into a workshop. And those are the big projects. There were smaller projects, mosaics, and just playful projects with wood or glass or tile. I'm now stepping into a part of the journey where I'm beginning to share those gifts I've cultivated over the last 15 to 20 years and begin to share them with other people. And so by just great good fortune, I shared it with a few people, and I'm already very busy, but there's always going to be room for creative projects that I'll be sharing with the world as either commissioned pieces or work that I will offer through my website. But I'm at the very infancy of all this, so I'm just putting the word out there. So if there's anything you've ever seen here that you were like, oh, I'd love something like that, give me a call. Understand that we're all creative beings, and in this way, I'm expressing my version of that.
And now, back to the conversation.
So before the break, we were talking about how human needs within techno-feudalism, or we could call it end-stage capitalism, our needs fall to the bottom of the list. In this way, we lose citizenship. We lose a voice. And in this way, we become human beings living out a long emergency. Now, what is the long emergency? Well, it's a concept introduced by James Howard Kunstler that examines the potential consequences of peak oil and argues that declining petroleum availability will converge with climate change, water scarcity, social and economic instability, declining birth rates, an aging worldwide population, various types of diseases, and warfare and, or probably better stated, rampant militarism that altogether creates sustained global crises. Kunstler's central theme focuses on how peak oil extraction will fundamentally disrupt American society and the global economy. In a broader sense, he speaks of the long emergency not as a moment in time, but an emergency that unfolds over decades. I offer that when we throw in the impact that social media and its overseers are having on how humanity connects, or frankly doesn't connect with ourselves, the division that has resulted within the long emergency has left us lost and divided as a society, with the larger consequences of the longer emergency still ahead of us. So how do we know that we are in the midst of the long emergency? I think it's right in front of us. Look at how we as human beings are showing up in the world. The mental health crisis, the obsessive, unhealthy relationship with social media, the inability to communicate amongst ourselves, the opposition of the wealthy class to do anything but act out of self-preservation and undermine the needs of the many. Economists and historians the world over, from Gary Stevenson to Rutger Bregman, respectively, posit that in light of the possibility for higher taxes on the wealthy, the oligarchs have chosen to fund right-wing governments across the world in order to avoid these higher taxes that would, in essence, move us closer to egalitarianism.
So, to present us within a framework of what happens to a society when, in particular, its population begins to age and its birth rate begins to decline, I think there's no better example, as unfortunate as it is to cite it as such, as what's happened in Japan over the last 35 years. More than 1 in 10 people in Japan are aged 80 or over. So that's reshaping the country in astronomical ways. Fumio Kishida, Japan's former prime minister, said in January 2023 that Japan is standing on the verge of whether we can continue to function as a society, facing as it does the twin threats of falling birth rates and their ever-increasing elderly population. I want to reiterate what he stated. On the verge of whether we can continue to function as a society. I say that and there's just this I get teary-eyed in this sense. The fact that we have gotten to such a point where there's that level of disconnect, and yet there is an awareness. He's saying it very plainly, very simply. Another element of this is the birth rate drop, right?
Here in the United States.
Especially here in the United States. And, right-wing politicians and policymakers, those in power, will cite that it's a problem because they want workers. Frankly, at the end of the day, they want the birth rate to go up so they can get you working in a computer chip manufacturing facility.
As an example, but the irony is that they don't want brown people, they want white people.
They want white people to do it. They want that working class. That's a tangent, although I think that it's in many ways a part of the larger makeup that we're talking about here. Gen Z and Gen Alpha not wanting to have children in this society, as many studies cite, including studies from the CDC, is not surprising. The idea of bringing up a child in such a dystopian society that is experiencing the larger climate change on multiple fronts is existentially terrifying. And from a practical standpoint, you just go, what is the feasibility of all of that? The general fertility rate in the United States itself has decreased by 3% from 2022. That's reaching a historic low. So that's happening. 2023 birth rates declined in women ages 20 to 39 years old. So there's this incredible shift, whether someone is making a conscious choice or not. And I would argue that many of our young people in the United States, even though there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of fear that they feel so potently, there is a very egalitarian choice being made when it comes to not wanting to bring up children in a society that functions as a techno-feudalist society, for instance, as other various forms of dystopia, as a society that, as we've been talking about, puts human needs last.
We began today with a quote from James Baldwin. He speaks of the reality behind words such as integrity, nobility, and courage, that they depend on our choices to become real. He's in essence speaking of presence. And presence, through my lens, occurs because a human being is well rested and in the ways that speak to them are able to be still within themselves at least some portion of the time. It really speaks to a willingness to truly be here for the sake of ourselves, for the sake of each other, and for the sake of the generations to come. And in the end, I ask you to ask yourself a very difficult question. Is a shrinking human population truly a bad thing for us and the planet? My answer is no. As a steward of my own land, my own family, I hold that less humans on the planet is a necessity. Humanity at this point has largely rejected a softer footprint as a way to address climate change and the myriad of other environmental factors that are almost entirely human generated. And that leaves us with one answer: less humans. And I would offer that declining birth rates is, in truth, an authentic expression of Baldwin's inquiry into integrity, nobility, and courage. That the choice not to bring children into a world such as this at this point in time contains far greater wisdom than we could ever imagine.
Language of the Soul, Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.